NumismaTalks. Every second and fourth Thursday of the month at noon Mountain, we will be here with a new presentation. During this presentation, you may come up with questions. If you do, please use the Q&A button on your screen to send in your question, and it will be answered at the end of the presentation. Now, I would like to introduce you to today's presenter, Caroline Turco. Caroline has a passion for storytelling. From the operatic stage to her historypod mic, she brings a unique blend of expertise and curiosity to the role of Assistant Curator at the ANA. A Renaissance woman at heart, Caroline loves art, history, and culture, which serendipitously mingle in the study of numismatics. When not at work researching coins or diving down rabbit holes, she can be found adventuring with her family to make new memories. Caroline will be presenting
Batavia's Bounty, Blood on the Coral, Silver in the Deep.
Thank you. That's my mistake for having your last presentation in my script. So anyway, thank you for your patience, and I'm handing it over to Caroline.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen and hope that this works. Okay.
Perfect.
All right, awesome. Okay, well, I'm excited to be here, and welcome to everyone. I am Caroline, as Paula said, the Assistant Curator here at the Money Museum in Colorado Springs. And this week, I want to honor the spookiest month of the year and tell you a very haunting tale. It is the story of a shipwreck off the coast of an uncharted continent in unknown waters and onto an unknown reef. It is also the story of a mutiny inspired by jealousy, alcohol, rage, lust, and money. It is also the story of a religious cult, a cult that deemed one man to be the voice of God's will, and his will was bloodthirsty. Finally, it is the story of one man, a man who lost everything, cajoled his way onto a ship, gained the ear of the captain, incited a mutiny, and took advantage of a devastating shipwreck and its lost, stranded passengers to enact an evil, psychotic plot, sacrificing men, women, and children in his wake. So yeah, this is one heck of a story, and it's all true. But how is a shipwreck numismatic? Well, because what lies beneath the waves is not only a story of tragedy, but also a story of money. Shipwrecks often serve as time capsules, preserving the very coins and bullion that powered global trade. From Spanish galleons sunk in the Caribbean to East Indiamen lost in the Indian Ocean, these wrecks reveal the currencies that connected continents, fueled empires, and determined the fate of entire voyages. And the Batavia is no exception. It is a tale that is haunting, but its purpose was financial, to carry silver half a world away. And why silver? Well, because in the great exchange between Europe and Asia, silver was the currency the East demanded. Batavia carried 12 chests of coins, which were later unearthed centuries after the wreck. And they tell us not only what treasure was being transported, but also where that silver came from, how it was minted, and why it was essential to global commerce. While collectors often measure a coin's worth in dollars and cents, some pieces carry a weight far beyond the marketplace, like this shipwreck coin. While it won't win a beauty contest, it represents an irreplaceable piece of history. With a provenance of romance, drama, and tragedy, it lies at the bottom of the sea waiting for us to discover it. Pulled from the deep more than 3 centuries after its minting, this 1622 thaler from Weimar, Germany, bears the unmistakable scars of trauma. On its reverse, seen here, the crowned double-headed eagle represents the authority of the Holy Roman Empire. The empire's most enduring emblem, the eagle's 2 heads symbolize dominion over East and West. At the center of the eagle's breast sits an orb surmounted by a cross, known as the globus cruciger. This symbol proclaimed the emperor's Christian sovereignty and represented the belief that worldly power was held under divine sanction. Within the orb is the number 32, a reference to the coin's value of 32 shillings, equivalent to 1 thaler. This was not the universal ratio, but it was a common one in northern Germany, and it assured users of the coin's place within the imperial monetary system at a time of widespread debasement. In 1622, when this coin was struck, Weimar was part of the Holy Roman Empire and a prosperous Hanseatic League trading port. The obverse depicts St. Laurentius, haloed and holding the gridiron that symbolized his martyrdom. According to tradition, in 258 CE, he was roasted alive over hot coals. Legend holds that he kept his faith till the bitter end, even joking, "Turn me over, I'm done on this side." St. Laurentius became one of the most venerated saints of the Middle Ages, celebrated as a protector of the poor and a steadfast servant of the church. His courage and humor in the face of suffering made him a popular figure across Europe. For Weimar in 1622, placing St. Laurentius on its coinage proclaimed both Christian piety and civic identity. The town had long honored him as its patron saint, and invoking his image during the turbulent troubles of the 30 Years' War underscored Weimar's loyalty to faith and resilience under hardship. The 30 Years' War had, in fact, only just begun 4 years earlier in 1618. And given the name, it obviously wouldn't end until 1648. Soon it engulfed the region, and it was primarily a religious conflict. So the choice of St. Laurentius reflected Weimar's resilience and Christian identity in a moment of looming crisis. Recovered sometime between 1971 and 1976 by the Western Australian Museum, this thaler is one of thousands of artifacts, especially silver coins, bound for trade in the Indies. And considering the tale that I am about to tell, the irony that this very ominous coin was part of Batavia's treasure is rather delicious. But first, why silver? Well, because that is what the Eastern trading powers wanted. Silver had a number of things going for it. First, it fit the scale of everyday trade. Gold was just too valuable for most transactions in Asian markets. But silver, on the other hand, was spendable yet divisible. Second is China. Beginning in the Ming Dynasty, China shifted its tax system to require payments in silver, not grain or paper, thus creating an enormous demand. And third, India, China, and Southeast Asia had a long-standing cultural tradition and monetary preference for silver as coinage. Gold was really reserved for jewelry, for dowries, or ceremonial purposes. Silver was the working currency of their markets and their taxation. And with that, let's begin the tale. This is the Batavia. It was one of the most expensive ships ever built, costing 100,000 guilders. And as a comparison, 300 guilders would sustain an entire family for a year. This brand new ship left Amsterdam as part of a 6-ship convoy bound for the Indies, carrying 12 treasure chests filled with silver bullion and silver coins. It was essentially a floating armored truck that also housed 340 people. Thousands of barrels of supplies, enough to sustain the passengers and crew for up to 1 year at sea, were stored below deck. The Batavia set sail on October 29th, 1628. Bound for the Dutch East Indies, its orders were to take the Brouwer route, seen here. Devised in 1611, it directed ships south from the Cape of Good Hope into the fierce into the fierce westerly winds of the Roaring Forties, which sped their voyage east across the Indian Ocean before turning north for Java. It was a big shortcut. It halved travel time to the east. But without the ability to determine longitude and thereby assess how far east a vessel had traveled, it caused numerous wrecks on Australia's then uncharted western coast. And the Batavia would be its next victim. On June 4th, 1629, the Batavia was on its 211th day at sea. It was a night like any other until, all at once, the massive ship slammed headfirst into a reef lying just below the surface. The Batavia, brand new and filled with treasure, was finished. Her first voyage would also be her last. Impaled on the half-hidden reef, her bow was completely crushed in the collision. Pandemonium set in. Below deck, around 270 people were thrown from their hammocks and sleeping mats. On deck, some men were already lost, and Batavia was drowning. If her crew and passengers didn't evacuate, they would too. In the chaos, Captain Arian Jacobs took charge. He made the fateful decision to cut down the 15-ton mast, which was coming dangerously close to falling through the keel. He knew this step would seal their fate and greatly anger the ship's powerful owners, and the captain himself therefore took the first swings of the axe. For 2 days, the captain and his crew worked tirelessly to rescue the passengers and valuables. With 2 small boats that survived the wreck, the skipper and his men saved as much and as many as they could. At the end of those 2 grueling days, the survivors were scattered into 3 groups. 180 men, women, and children had been safely removed to an island which they dubbed Batavia's Graveyard. 70 men remained stranded on the wreckage, which continued to break apart hour by hour. The captain, under merchant, whom we'll get to in just a moment, and a group of the ship's officers struck out to find fresh water, but they found none. Ensconced on a small islet, this lucky group contained most of the ship's leadership, controlled both of the surviving boats, retained all the navigation equipment, and held most of the food and water reserves. After surveying the small islands around, Captain Jacobs concluded that for any of them to survive, he must sail for Java. Their intended destination, Java, was more than 2,000 miles away over open ocean. A fact we know now, but it was an absolute guess based on unfinished charts, the appearance of the seaweed, and pure intuition. To even attempt this Hail Mary, he would need his most seasoned sailors and, of course, all of the remaining water and food. In effect, Captain Arian Jacobs decided who would sail for help and who would be marooned, left to fend for themselves. And frankly, someone did have to make these tough calls because the alternative of all waiting there together was an absolute death sentence. However, this decision wasn't actually Jacobs to make because the Batavia belonged to the Dutch East India Company. Also known as the VOC, the company was founded in 1602. A seafaring giant. It was the world's first multinational corporation linking Europe to Asia through bustling trade of exotic goods that dazzled Europe. But the VOC's influence wasn't all fragrant spices and glittering profits. Granted quasi-governmental powers, it ruled vast territories across the Indian Ocean and Southwest Asia, especially in the Dutch East Indies, which is today's Indonesia. On this map here, you can see the various hubs in the Arabian Peninsula, Indian subcontinent, Chinese mainland, Japanese islands, and of course, the East Indies. Java was the cultural and economic hub of the islands that today make up Indonesia, and Batavia, as you'll note in the bottom right-hand corner, was the historic capital founded by the Dutch. Today, we call it Jakarta. Making things even more ironic, Batavia, the ship, would never arrive at its namesake destination. Backed by private armies, the VOC often enforced monopolies through violence, enslavement, and exploitation. The VOC both expanded the horizons of the known world and revealed the darker costs of global commerce. Aboard a Dutch East India ship, power was carefully divided between sailors, merchants, and soldiers, but it valued profits over anything else, and therefore the sailing captain was subordinate to the undermerchant. Batavia's captain was named Arian Jacobs. We already met him. He was responsible for navigation, safety, and discipline at sea and held command of the vessel and its crew. But he was not in charge of the voyage. The upper merchant ranked above him in matters of commerce, cargo, booking, and trade negotiations. The highest ranking company official on board, the upper merchant could and did overrule the captain on commercial matters, like abandoning a fortune of silver coins on an unknown reef in uncharted waters. In practice, the upper merchant almost always protected the valuable cargo over the somewhat replaceable crew. To make things even more interesting, a military officer of the VOC, who was in charge of soldiers that defended the ship and once they reached their destination enforced VOC authority abroad, sailed alongside. And this unusual hierarchy reflected the company's complex position as both a business and a state power. Part trading firm, part naval fleet, part private army, every shipboard decision, from trimming sails to sealing trade deals, had to balance these overlapping spheres of command. Obviously, it would depend on the personalities of the captain and the upper merchant, but often the two men were at odds. Most sea captains, hardened by many years on the ocean, struggled to be submissive to a man who often had no sailing experience. And the Batavia's leaders were no exception. The captain, Arian Jacobs, had served the VOC for 2 decades at this point and voyaged to the East Indies many times. Company records also indicate that he was an excessive drinker and a lecherous womanizer. It's kind of weird that they kept those records, but they also reported that he was an exceptional navigator, minus that time he crashed the ship, so good to keep records. The upper merchant was Francisco Pelcert. He was a company man through and through, and this voyage was his well-earned reward. Sailing aboard the newest feather in the VOC's cap, he commanded a convoy of 6 East Indiaman ships. Captain Jacobs and upper merchant Pelcert had actually met before, and they did not get along. It's actually a very ridiculous story, but it is important for the rest of it, so here we go. At a gathering in the Indies years before the Batavia ever set sail, a very drunk Captain Jacobs insulted upper merchant Pelcert in front of his fellow merchants. Someone was a bit of a tattletale, and the Captain Jacobs was formally rebuked for his behavior. The ironic result was that Jacobs hated Pelcert for embarrassing him, and Pelcert hated Jacobs for exactly the same thing. All of which led to some very awkward moments on board the Batavia. While an enormous ship for its time, the Batavia was only 160 feet long. Today's cargo ships can be up to 1,200 feet in length. The two men shared the same office, ate in the same wardroom, and even used the same head, one of just 4 toilets on the entire ship. So it is easy to see how that one initial grain of sand began to grow into an absolute pearl of hatred. And to be fair, the skipper's behavior, including but not limited to drunkenness, taking boats without permission for his own personal joyrides, and engaging in a raucous affair with a maid on board, did not help matters. Pelcert was required to admonish Jacobs several times, which did not sit well with the seafaring captain. He began to vent his anger and frustration to the under merchant, yes, there's another one, who was second in command to the upper merchant. The under merchant aboard the Batavia was named Geronimus Cornelis. Batavia's inaugural voyage was his first as well. Previously a well-respected apothecary with a good education and from a stable family, Cornelius's life took a devastating turn. His wife gave birth to a baby boy, and the family hired a wet nurse. Tragically, the baby died in the most gruesome way within a few months. He contracted syphilis, and I will spare you the details of what that entails. The parents were devastated, and they pointed a murderous finger at the wet nurse, accusing her of sleeping around and giving their baby a horrific STD. And they took the matter to court. However, she turned the tables and sued them for defamation, claiming it was the wife who had syphilis, not her. Quite tricksy. Because honestly, would you risk buying medicines from a possibly syphilitic pharmacist, or would you just go somewhere else in case? The shop failed. He went bankrupt, which, fun fact, was then considered a mortal sin in the United Dutch provinces. Brought to his knees, he signed over all of his possessions. And then he left. He left his wife, his city, and his profession. Fleeing to Amsterdam, he looked to make his fortune elsewhere, which is just where he found himself, employed by the VOC as under merchant on the Batavia, bound for the Indies. It is a tragic tale. However, we shouldn't feel too bad for this guy because first, he did abandon the wife after selling the poor woman's possessions and home and, leaving her in a bereaved state. And second, because Geronimus Cornelis was not your average Dutch Calvinist. Though raised soberly in the Anabaptist faith, dressed in black from head to toe, he veered greatly off course as an adult. While likely a psychopath in his own right, his friends introduced him to a new and enticing religion that would define the rest of his life. To make a long and winding story short, Geronimus believed that all he did, God put in his heart. He thought he lived in a state of grace, liberated from the restrictions of man because he and he alone was incapable of sin. Good, bad, or ugly, anything that popped into his head, he believed, was put there by God. And therefore, he just had to, or was allowed to, act upon those thoughts. It's a very scary doctrine that is today known as antinomianism. It espouses that mortal law isn't binding on an individual who exists in a state of perfection. I don't know anybody like that, but should you, that'd be cool. Now, let's go back to the narrative. Just a few months into Batavia's voyage, Captain Jacobs begins to vent his frustrations to Geronimus Cornelis, former apothecary, secret heretic, and now newly minted undermerchant. Cunning and morally exempt, Geronimus saw an opportunity and grabbed hold. He emboldened the belligerent captain and sparked mutinous thoughts. Together, they hatched a violent plan and began to recruit men to their mutiny. However, before I tell you their evil machinations, I want to explain why other men would be willing to risk their own lives to join this duo's murderous mutiny. Was ship life really that bad? Yes, the answer is yes. As a Navy spouse myself, I have some knowledge of life aboard modern ships, to include cramped quarters, limited bathrooms, and in the case of submarines, hot racking, where 3 people share a single bed and switch off based on their watch schedules. Sounds pleasant. But life aboard the Batavia was drastically worse. Most of the sailors had been pressed into service and did not want to be there. The soldiers on board were similarly disgruntled, and most were heading for garrison duty, which meant 5 grueling years in the Indies away from anything and anyone they'd known before. Batavia's few passengers, who were neither crew nor company, were headed to the new life in the East Indies for varying reasons, but none of them were here for a pleasure cruise. And together, the crew, army, and passengers sailed 15,000 miles, more than halfway around the world, without ever enjoying a single shower. Although honestly, their inevitable stench wasn't nearly as bad as that of the rotting meat they consumed, worms and all. It is said that within months, all aboard could distinguish between insect species by their flavors. Weevils, for example, were quite bitter, while cockroaches tasted sausagey. But maggots, those were the worst. They were described as spongy and cold. I could go on and on about the quality of life on board, the stinking food, horrific punishments, communal rope for toilet paper, but I digress. Suffice to say, for many aboard the Batavia, mutiny might have seemed like the better of 2 evils, especially if they could disappear with enough silver to last all of their lifetimes. Before long, mutiny was afoot, and while uncommon aboard VOC ships, it wasn't unheard of, which is why the VOC had a number of significant obstacles in place to prevent mutinous undertakings. But all of them really required the captain to remain loyal to the company. Once the skipper was ready to revolt, the guy who talks to all the sailors, oversees the weapons locker, and has the navigational experience, it's game over. Amazingly, Jacobs and Geronimus, so captain and heretic undermerchant, managed to keep very tight-lipped about their plan, and the exact number of participants is unknown to this day. However, we do know that it was a significant portion of the crew, to include merchants, cadets, soldiers, sailors, and officers. While we can't lay the entire mutinous blame at Geronimus's feet, he does seem to have been the mastermind, in part because Jacobs was noted for being pretty stupid. And to be honest, the plan was cunning. Step 1, separate the Batavia from the other 5 ships in the convoy, which is easily accomplished with the skipper on board. Step 2, recruit a sufficient body of men to take control and sail the ship through a combination of bribes and threats. Easy peasy. Step 3, turn the entire crew against upper merchant Pelsert. And this is where Geronimus's plan deviates from your standard run-of-the-mill mutiny, because he came up with the weirdest, most evil plan. To provoke full-blown mutiny, he urged Batavia's roughest sailors to attack the beautiful, high-class married passenger named Lucrezia Jan, for whom all of them had a thing. This is not her, but I think you get the picture. Masked, the men seized, violated, and disfigured her. It was incredibly savage, and as planned, word of her distress spread quickly. Geronimus believed that such butchery would force the upper merchant to respond aggressively, and he was right. Commander Pelsert took the news, quote, very violently and to the highest degree. Thus far, the vile plan was working. Because the butchers were masked, Pelsert didn't know whom to punish. The mutineers assumed he would therefore be forced to punish the entire crew, which would foment anger and incite the planned mutiny. However, Pelsert shocked the criminal conspirators. He exercised restraint. Had he acted, had he fitted and raged, had he yard-armed and keel-hauled, he would have found himself attacked in the night and tossed into the sea. But he didn't. Or at least he never had the chance. Instead, that night, 211 days into the voyage, the Batavia slammed into a reef, sinking alongside the mutiny. The Batavia had stumbled onto a chain of low-lying reefs. Brand new and filled with treasure, her crew and passengers must evacuate or perish. And now we return to the main narrative of the tale. The surviving passengers are again scattered into those 3 contingents. 180 men, women, and children are marooned on the lovingly termed Batavia's Graveyard Island. 70 men were still stranded on the sinking wreckage, and the captain, upper merchant, and roughly 50 sailors occupied a small islet holding all the food, water, and navigational instruments that had been recovered. Remarkably, the leadership actually agreed. The brutal reality was that for any of them to survive, a skeleton crew, meaning the guys on that island with all the good stuff, must sail for Java. So they retrofitted the larger of the 2 longboats to accommodate the crew and 2 choice passengers, to include the captain's mistress, who had caused so much trouble, and a new mother with a baby in her arms. Abandoning the rest, they set off on a Hail Mary attempt to reach Java to save themselves. From now, we will leave them on their perilous journey north and turn to the leftovers, to those who did not warrant a spot on that lifeboat. Those encamped on the graveyard were in dire circumstances. Within the first 24 hours, they consumed all the fresh water. And from there, thirst and hunger pains began to set in. As their stomachs growled with pain, their saliva thickened to a paste. Their lips cracked, their tongues hardened, and their eyes wept with blood. After 2 days, 10 were dead, and the rest barely clung to life. They drank urine, some even drank seawater. They chewed on lead pellets, hoping to induce saliva. Eventually, they drank the blood of birds and sea lions, anything to help them find relief. Thankfully, after 4 days of dry, it rained. The people on the island caught fresh water and replenished their meager supplies, after which they decided to form a leadership council headed by the highest ranking officer on the island, the surgeon. In name only, he was mostly a barber with a box of medicines and knives. Oddly, the 70 or so men still on the wreckage were doing just fine because they had plenty to eat and drink scavenged from the stores. Like naughty teenagers whose parents were away for the weekend, they partied. They got drunk, moved into the private officers' quarters, looted the jewels, and decadently threw vast quantities of this precious silver overboard in giant fistfuls. After all, money couldn't help them now. But the ship, it was a ticking time bomb. It was slowly breaking apart, and the party on deck was not helping things. After 8 days, she was gone. Most on board couldn't swim, and therefore, on that final day, 50 of the revelers drowned. Only 20 managed to save themselves, clinging to planks of wood. And now, cue the evil organ music. Unable to swim, yet unwilling to die, Geronimus Cornelis crafted a raft out of the ruins and drifted for more than 2 days, clinging for life until his raft disintegrated, at which point he found a mass of driftwood. He slowly floated to the Batavia graveyard island. 10 days after the wreck, 2 of which were spent alone floating on debris, Geronimus finally made it to the island. The other survivors ran to help him. Rushing to his aid, they treated him kindly and praised God for saving him. He was the very last man to escape the Batavia alive. The Batavia was no more. However, its final destruction greatly increased the survivors' supplies. Over the next few days, 500 gallons of water and, fortunately, 550 gallons of wine slowly washed ashore. But even on half rations, they wouldn't last more than a few days. Someone needed to take charge, to make a plan to find a solution. And all eyes now turned to the new highest-ranking officer left, Under Merchant Geronimus Cornelis. He was elected to the leadership council. His education and articulate manner quickly elevated him above the others. So first things first, this dude needs a tent. Big, all to himself, obviously. He also requisitioned the upper merchant Pelserts left behind uniforms. Remember, one should dress for the job they want, not the job they have. Only then did this guy go about the business of keeping everyone else safe. And that is when the facade began to fade. He quickly tired of those responsibilities. As boredom set in, tongues began to wag. Some of the marooned people started to talk about that mutiny that he'd planned. And that, guess, didn't sync with the Batavia. Geronimus was worried. He hadn't been named yet, but if he was, he would definitely lose his high status and respect on the island. And of course, that would mean no more private tent, no more fancy uniform, and even worse, it could mean a death sentence upon his return. It just wouldn't do. His goal, which of course, as the elected leader of the graveyard island became everyone's goal, was to stay alive until rescued, no matter what. The council quickly became a burden to him, and they kept insisting on ridiculous things like rationing, which meant that no one was full, but also no one starved. And that would not do. He had to get rid of people. And therefore, he went back to his old playbook and enacted the mutiny he'd already planned. Gathering what remained of his original followers, he billeted them together in tents to separate them from the rest of the group. And he then demanded that, as the VOC's representative, he have full control of the weapons and the food. He sent his cronies to look for food and water on other islands. They found none. But he told everyone they'd had great success. And then he began to move small groups of people to these various islands. He would take them there, instruct them to collect food and water, and promise to return shortly with new supplies. But he never would. So let's look at the map. This is the site of the wreckage. This is the island dubbed the graveyard. And you can see that there are plenty of other small pieces of land on which to stow away / desert his unwanted responsibilities. He placed a group of 40 men, women, and children here, and a party of 15 here. But most importantly, he removed all of the soldiers that were not part of his motley gang, and they got to go here. Once on the island, they were relieved of their weapons and marooned to die. Cornelis methodically removed as many people as possible using this divide and conquer strategy. And as a result, he only had about 90 people left on his island to share his food and his supplies. And that is when the killings began. Geronimus believed that he was God's chosen one. Therefore, God obviously did not want him to die, which meant any person standing in the way of his survival deserved to die. First on the chopping block, the council. Geronimus now had total control. Next up were 2 men accused of making a raft. Their fate? Death. His next victims were from a recently abandoned search party. They found water and signaled their find with fire. This alerted everyone, including the other abandoned groups on other islands, who watched in horror as Geronimus sent 7 of his men to dispatch the entire party, which consisted of 2 families. The children were slain instantly. 3 of the adults jumped into the water attempting to flee and then drowned. The remaining brave men fought, but unarmed, they didn't stand a chance and all died brutally. That left 3 women who were dragged out to sea, rowed into deep water, and pushed overboard to be drowned, weighted down by their voluminous skirts. And this horrific massacre happened in full view of all remaining survivors. Geronimus's true character was thus revealed. But kind of grossly, hoping to save their own skins, pretty much everybody else on the island flocked to join him. They were afraid of what would happen to them next. But Geronimus wasn't stupid. He wanted assurance. To join his motley crew, he required deadly demonstrations of their loyalty. I'm not going to detail every murderous initiation. Suffice to say, they were all bad, they were all savage, and they were generally against the young and the weak. A man named Andreas de Vries, for example, was ordered to kill 11 people in the sick tent. Useless mouths, Geronimus referred to them. And the next day, de Vries was ordered to kill another 5 who had fallen ill overnight. The murderers came at night with hatchets. Standing out in any way could spell death. Generally, his most ardent followers were ruffians. They were people who had never enjoyed respect back home, and they existed on that bottom rung of society. So now they could act like kings with absolutely no repercussions. They enjoyed better rations, nicer clothes, and cleaner tents. With every kill, Geronimus's men grew more bloodthirsty. Frequently, one victim turned into 2 or even 15, until there remained only one big target left. The predicant, or the minister. Amazingly, his entire family, his wife, 7 children, and their maid, had all survived the wreck, the starvation times, the unimaginable thirst, and the murderous mutineers. But all good things must come to an end. The eldest daughter had already been married or forced to sleep with one of the mutineers, and it was sheer self-preservation and, frankly, a common story among all of the surviving women. But the rest of the family were living together in their own tent. Geronimus was now openly espousing his heretical beliefs, attempting to remove his men from the influence of other theologies. He gave daily sermons trying to indoctrinate them. He encouraged them all to swear. He told them to blaspheme, and he forbid prayers or religious services of any kind. However, despite all of this, he wasn't willing to murder a minister. Actually, he never murdered anyone. Interesting fact. He actually ordered all of these killings and did attempt one poisoning of an infant, but despite being an apothecary, he somehow failed to even finish that and had to have somebody else do it for him. So anyway, this spineless monster ordered the men to finish off the minister's family, minus the minister and the eldest daughter who was being used in other ways. The now professional murderers dug a mass grave before they brutally hacked the entire family to death. After they finished, they sat down and ate that family's meal, which was still warm above the fire, and they were unbothered by the bodies that littered the tent. At this point, I'm sure you're thinking, aren't they all dead by now? And also, when are we getting to the treasure? And both questions are valid. But first, I have to tell you about the plot twist. Remember all those soldiers Geronimus had abandoned right here? Well, it turns out that island was far better resourced than he realized. In fact, it was relatively habitable with plenty of fresh water and good fishing grounds. The men had become particularly fond of a previously unknown creature, which they called cats. According to the survivors, wallabies are quite tasty. These soldiers had actually elected their own leader, a man named Weba Hayes. Weba and his men quickly realized that Geronimus was up to no good. After signaling they'd found water but receiving no reply, and then witnessing the savage murder of all those families, followed by nightly screams of new victims, they knew something was amiss. Unarmed, they were sitting ducks, so Weba called his men to action. They made weapons from what they had on hand. In this commemorative statue, Weba yields a makeshift cutlass with a bush timber handle attached to a sharpened hoop iron for a blade. They also fashioned pikes from the ship's planks, tipped with 16-inch long nails, and they improvised morning stars from leftover wood and metal. Weba proved to be an inspirational leader. Thank goodness. In the end, thanks to the massive killing spree of Geronimus and his men, the islands possessed roughly the same number of able-bodied men. Both islands anxiously awaited rescue, if it ever came. And at the time, based on kind of some crude estimations, they thought it was drawing near. That's when Geronimus discovered that Weba Hayes and his men were not only alive, but ready to fight. If they told the rescuers, should they arrive, that Geronimus's evil deeds, he was sunk. Contrarily, Weba and his men feared for the lives of the rescuers. They assumed, correctly, that Geronimus planned to murder anyone that came back to rescue them, take that ship as his own, turn pirate with the leftover silver, and leave everybody else for dead. So the two islands were at an impasse. First, Geronimus tried diplomacy. He wrote a stupid letter that he hoped would split the ragtag group of men and create a mini civil war. And he added this ridiculous PS, "Can you please return our boat?" Like that's going to work. Instead, they chose to take that messenger hostage. Next came a boat of 20 mutineers ordered to kill Weba and his men. But they failed, and the mutineers thus returned with their tails between their legs. His third idea was remarkably similar to the second. He sent back the same guys, and the result was the same. It was kind of embarrassing. So after some time to reflect upon his own stupidity, he came up with a new tactic. He decided to offer a false peace, to come in accord under the cloak of friendship, and then, surprise, with treason. This time, Geronimus personally came to meet Hayes. He was incredibly confident that A, God willed him to do this, and that B, he was invincible because of point A, and C, he could convince Weba Hayes of his sincerity. The two men spoke briefly, and Geronimus wove his web of lies. But the parley was a trap. In one fluid motion, Weba's men overcame Geronimus's personal bodyguard of 4 mutineers, murdering them on the spot and taking Geronimus hostage. Aha! Geronimus now found himself living in a limestone pit. To make him useful, Weba gave him the job of bird plucker. And this meant that the rebel men would throw slaughtered birds into the pit for him to pluck. He was required to return 8 of 9 birds, and the last one he got to keep and eat raw. And that's where he lived, splattered with guts and feathers, living and eating in his own excrement. The remaining mutineers retrenched. Despite losing 4 of their best men, not to mention their religious and military leader, the group of less than 20 men remained determined to overcome Weba's band of rebels. Why? Because they had no choice. They had all signed an oath, proclaiming loyalty to each other and obedience to Geronimus. In effect, they'd signed their own death sentences should rescuers ever arrive to discover their heinous deeds. Outnumbered, they used their one and only advantage, weaponry. From afar, they began to pick off Weba's men one by one, until at last the brawl became a hand-to-hand battle. Locked in combat, the mutineers began to sense a victory. They could almost taste it when a ship sailed into view. The long-awaited rescue had arrived. The 40 or so men, once locked in battle, now stared at the vessel as it slowly appeared on the horizon. And then it dawns on them. The final battle is now a race, and history will be written by the victors. Almost in unison, the men dropped their weapons and ran to their makeshift rafts. Each side sent its strongest rowers. Already hours into a bloody battle, these desperate men clutched at their last depths of strength. For one boat of men, dressed in rags and armed with crude spikes, the rescue ship meant salvation. For the other, outfitted in make-believe uniforms of red and gold, the rescue ship meant death. And now I will leave these murderous mutineers and ragtag rebels to row it out on the water. And while they race toward their rescue vessel, I'll give a highly abridged version of what happened to Captain Jacobs, Upper Merchant Pelsert, and their own struggle to return to Java, because I bet some of you had completely forgotten about them. 48 men, women, and children, plus a baby in arms, set off on that overcrowded 30-foot longboat. 23 days later, that longboat sighted the Javan coastline. They had only 2 pints of drinking water left on board. And miraculously, all 48 men, women, and children, even the baby, survived. So I guess Jacobs was actually a pretty good captain. It was an incredible feat. And while we are all here cheering those brave souls on, the VOC, the most powerful company in the world at that time, was not quite so thrilled. The Batavia and its cargo represented 300,000 guilders, which is something like $30 million today. The Governor General of the VOC in the Indies, this fancy pants right here, well, he was not pleased, no. However, Pelsert, trying to salvage his job and his reputation, convinced the governor to send a small yacht back to the wreckage with provisions, waters, cables, and anchors in hopes of a rescue. Not to rescue the people, but to recover the silver. Literally, the orders read, quote, so the company may receive some recompense to balance its great loss. Pelsert's personal writings give us a vivid account of what he found upon returning to the wreckage. Quote, a man named Weba Hayes sprang aboard and ran toward me, calling from afar, welcome, but go back immediately. For there is a party of scoundrels on the islands with 2 sloops who have an intention to seize this yacht. He goes on to state that after a single look at the mutineers' pretend uniforms, he was convinced. And after a brief standoff, the fight was over and the mutineers surrendered. After delivering swift justice to the mutineers, Pelsert went about the VOC's business. He was instructed to recover as much of the money as possible and to use divers, if at all possible, to salvage the caskets of jewels and the treasure chests filled with money. And that was no easy task. He reported difficulties in pulling up the heavy chests. It took more than 3 months to get them. His crew labored and recovered what they could. The Batavia carried an estimated 250,000 guilders in 12 wooden chests, which each contained about 8,000 coins. The money was intended for the purchase of spices and other commodities in Java, which means that the bulk of the coins were silver, mostly produced by the individual Dutch states, as well as similar pieces produced by German cities like Hamburg. Of the roughly 12 chests or 96,000 coins, 10 of them were recovered by Pelsert, meaning he recovered about 80,000 pieces of silver. The other 2 were eventually abandoned. One had been the one that Cornelis and his men had broken apart while partying as the ship sunk, and the other was jammed under a cannon. And that is the one that we have today to look back at and examine for historical purposes. The wreck of Batavia was discovered 300 years after the VOC ship sunk on that reef. In 1963, the first successful excavations were conducted on Beacon Island, where 17th century Dutch artifacts were found along with human skeletons. And these finds confirmed the hunch that the island had in fact been Batavia's graveyard. And that led to the discovery of the shipwreck on the nearby Morning Reef. Later that year, a team of civilian and military divers conducted the first underwater excavation of the Batavia wreck. And then between 1963 and the early 1970s, excavators logged more than 2,000 diving hours. During that time, they revealed anchors, cannons, stoneware, timbers, and coins. Most of the pieces recovered were minted in the Dutch Republic and the German states, demonstrating how essential European silver coinage was to global trade. Accepted across continents because of its trusted bullion content, it was the lifeblood of transcontinental trade. However, there was a very decent mix of coins, which indicates that the VOC didn't rely on a single issue, but gathered silver from across Europe, melted or not, to fund its ventures. The sheer volume of coins recovered, which of course represents only about 1/6 of the total cargo, demonstrates the enormous value of this single trading voyage. Cross-continental trade was a gamble. It required putting most of your coins in the same floating basket. Therefore, VOC ships were a huge target for mutiny and piracy, which is something we saw in this story. The size of the pieces, too, reflect the company's larger scale commercial transactions. Almost all were crown-sized coins intended for bulk trade, less so for daily purchases. And interestingly, many of the coins showed significant signs of wear from circulation, which means they had already traveled through European markets before being shipped east, reinforcing the fact that silver was universally the currency, and it was more trusted by weight and fineness than by issuing authority. So let's take a look at some of the many types of silver recovered from the wreck. All of these are from the Australian museum that did the initial excavations, and they have labeled them as best they could. Interestingly, a lot of them were able to be identified. Riksdalers, like this one, were the most common, but not all of them could be determined as to their original place of origin. However, this piece was from Holland and Zealand. And then here is a Burgundian daelder from the Spanish Netherlands. Riksdaler here was issued by Rudolf II from 1596. And then we have another one from 1623, minted in West Friesland. Each of these lets us know who was participating in this cultural trade and how far-reaching the VOC's arms of trade really were. This is an 8 reals from Spanish America. It's not one of the most common denominations, but it's certainly a telling one. New World silver that traveled back to Europe, then went on to the Indies. And here's another 8 reals, circa 1620. From the Lübeck Mint, we have a German thaler of 1621. From Hamburg, issued by Rudolf II in 1606. Here we have another thaler, and perhaps my favorite, because I just love the wild man thalers, this one was issued by Heinrich Julius in 1602. I know I went through those quickly, but the concept is to show just how vast an array of places these pieces came from. Unfortunately, due to incomplete records, I can't give a complete epilogue. Many of the survivors were never heard from again, but I can resolve some of the most alluring questions. Following the climactic defeat of the mutineers, interrogations began right away. Many of the mutineers readily confessed, giving full accounts of the killings, the cult, and the intended mutiny. While no one claimed that Geronimus was a murderer, because in fact he had failed to do so even when he tried, all of the confessions concluded that he was the cause of all of the troubles. Geronimus, when he appeared in front of Pelsaert, was quite the sight. His pompous uniform in tatters, he was covered in bird feces and feathers and stunk of rotten meat and his own secretions. So it was the very picture of a fallen man. But for his part, he claimed absolutely no involvement and said that he had only ever acted in self-preservation and was forced into this role by all of the other people. Justice in the United Dutch provinces was very specific at the time. A man could only be convicted to death by his own confession without the use of torture. But torture could absolutely be applied both before and after said confession. So it didn't take much for this cowardly man to cave. And he most definitely named as many people as possible to bring them down with him. Geronimus was convicted and sentenced. First, his hands were cut off with a hammer and chisel, and then he went to the gallows. 4 of his elite mutineers received the same punishments. 3 others were hanged, but got to keep their hands for the afterlife. 9 more were brought back to Java for further interrogation, although in the end, they were actually punished in transit, and we're not quite sure why, but they were sentenced to keel hauling and yard arming, which were both highly dangerous and terrible ways to go. Finally, 2 men were marooned on a desert island, never to be heard from again, although there have been some searches to try to figure out where exactly they were left. 19 men were freed, those who had signed the oath but never participated in the bloodshed. And on the flip side, Wiebe Hayes here was rewarded for his brave actions. He received a very swift promotion and his salary was doubled. Although I do have to say that he didn't actually survive much longer. Once he reached the Indies, he died of disease within about a year. And he wasn't the only one. Francisco Pelsert, the upper merchant who returned to the scene of the wreck to discover the mutinous cult, died within a year of disease. Captain Jacobs had a very unwelcome surprise when the rescue ship returned with tale of his attempted mutiny, which had in fact not sunk alongside the Batavia. Despite repeated torture, he never confessed, but he ultimately died in jail while awaiting trial. Geronimus left so many victims in his wake. His abandoned wife, for example, survived losing her son, husband, home, and belongings, and records indicate that she lived long enough to at least hear of her husband's horrific crimes and execution. And thanks to Pelsert's meticulous notes during the trials, as well as a long list of confessions, it's estimated that 115 people died due to Geronimus's murderous plots. They included 96 men and boys, 12 women, and 7 young children. All of these stories, all of these people might easily have been lost if Wiebe Hayes and his men had rowed just that much slower than the mutineers. And it goes to show it doesn't take much to change the course of history. And with that, I hope you've enjoyed Batavia's horrifying story and really seen the impact that money has for historians as we're looking at things and we're able to look at these coins and really trace what's happened. This is the only evidence we have left, and the coins tell us so much about the trade network that they were a part of and reveal these horrific stories in the long run. So I will stop sharing. Oops, nope.
Very cool. Yeah, you got it.
Oh, good. I did it. Oh, okay.
All right. So we don't have any questions. So I'm going to do my wrap up. And then if any pop in, we'll touch on the questions at the end. So I just want to thank you, Caroline, and thank everybody for joining us for a great presentation. Our NumismaTalks are being recorded and will be available once they are edited on money.org/education. Please be sure to check our future programs on our website. At that same location. I hope that I see some of you back later. And we have a question that popped up. A comment, outstanding. Do you have a favorite American coin?
Oh, yes, I do. Yes, I do. I love the 1792 half diem. We have it in the museum. The one that was supposedly made by George Washington and David Rittenhouse in the basement across the street from the first U.S. Mint. I really love stories, as you can probably tell. And so I appreciate coins that have that kind of special spark of history to them. So I really appreciate things of that nature. But I also have really enjoyed looking at some of these modern mints that we're having right now. I really like seeing our quarters change, and I like enjoying that we're spreading our history and our culture through coinage in a way that is quite different and unique from most other times in our history. We're kind of taking a new spin on that, and I love that.
Betty says, thank you. Love the story. And another, this was great. Thanks. You are a great storyteller. So these are all absolutely Not unexpected. Gruesome but informative. Thank you. Again, thanks so much for the educational presentation. Got on late. VOC means?
That's the Dutch East India Company, and the VOC is the initials for the Dutch name. So it is known as VOC because Dutch East India Company said 9 times fast is really hard. So I went with that. But they were the most powerful company in the world for almost 100 years. And as I said, something between a business and a governing power with the amount of impact they had on the world at large.
Another few great stories and fascinating history. So obviously, thank you, Caroline. Everybody enjoyed the history of this and the story and the way you told it. So I appreciate you and I appreciate everybody for being here. And I hope everybody has a great day.
All right. Hopefully you don't go on a ship today because it seems like a bad omen after
right.
No
Thank
rest.
you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.